Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is the Spiritual Hacking Conference Call. I am Abraham Calhoun, your spiritual coach and founder of Peace With. If this is your first time hearing about Peace With, we are a company dedicated to bringing peace to the workspace. We do this predominantly through one-on-one coaching with executive leadership, as well as doing staff workshops around emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, all from a spiritual and wisdom-based perspective in order to bring a new level of elevation into the workspace. We have an exciting call today because the topic we're going to be discussing is slide. The slide that many people experience after educational programs. And so just going to jump right in with it. We've all been there before where we've joined a workout program. It's January, we're ready to get our day or our year started off strong. So we join this workout program and we do it steadily for maybe about 6 to 8 weeks, and we get in the groove and really feeling the vibe of the group, and we're having shared experiences with the other people who are in the group, and then all of a sudden that program ends, and you are left to going back into the real world that was before that program. And there comes a really big question. Am I going to successfully continue this program on my own, or am I going to slide back into old patterns and habits? And generally, most people start to slide back into those old patterns and habits unless they have a lot of self-control. And so we see the same thing happening with other types of programs like professional development programs, and you also see this in school. It's something that happens every year. As a teacher, your students would go away for the summer, there would be a slide that happens, and then you'd come back in, and at some point they've lost a whole reading level or something like that. So slide is a real thing that happens. And what is interesting is the longer a program actually runs, the less likely slide is going to happen. But at the end of the day, if there is some sort of substantial gap between the program, between the end of the program and the start of the program, slide is something that takes place. So during my studies in the Middle East, when I was doing peace education, I wrote my thesis on something called the ethos of conflict and measuring peace. How do you actually know when your peace program is working? And of course, one of the things that we had to look at in this was the reality of slide, that participants were going into these peace programs with other individuals from the other side that they were in conflict with, were making really great strides. And then their attitudes would shift, their perspectives of the other would shift, and then they would go back into their societies, and all of those positive attributes that had been made during the program were lost after about a 6-month period. So we saw this with programs that were focused specifically on youth, but also programs that were focused on adults. And what was so fascinating to me as we were studying this is everyone kind of had this really big question. Well, what's the problem? What's going on? So there was this one researcher who over the last 20 years had really been studying the social psychological infrastructure of conflict. What's happening to people's psychology when they are experiencing intense conflict, and how do we understand those worldviews that are developed? And so as they started to research, Daniel Bartal and his entire team at Tel Aviv University, they started to discover that when you have intense, intractable conflicts, like the one in the Middle East or the one between India and Pakistan or Cyprus and Turkey, for example, there tends to be themes that start to develop within the ethos or the worldview. Our ethos is kind of this frozen mindset. It's our underlying consciousness that drives our attitudes and our perceptions of the world. And this ethos holds beliefs about politics. It holds beliefs about the idea of unity, about the idea of security, about the idea of victimization, about the idea of the other, right? So there are all of these themes that are starting to reveal themselves as we study the psychology of conflict. Now, what is so fascinating is that these peace education programs that were happening, that I was looking at, were hardly ever making any sort of changes to that ethos of conflict. So, of course, during program, what you saw was a lot of attitudinal shifts and perspectives of the other change. But the underlying ethos, what they truly believed about the conflict, what they truly believed about the other, what they truly believed about patriotism, about victimization, stayed the same. And so it's almost as if you imagine in the United States where you are a staunch Democrat and you come into contact, you go into a program with people on the other side of the aisle, and you make some really good relationships with these individuals, on a personal level, right? And so you start to see them in a new light. So your attitudes and perspectives start to change a little bit about how you think about Republicans. But then when you go back into your full Democratic space, those underlying beliefs that you had about freedom, about where the country should be going, they stay the same. And so yes, your attitudes may have shifted because you develop some positive relationships with people on the other side, but your true belief system that drives your worldview does not change. And so this is one of the biggest challenges of any sort of educational program that is trying to achieve change. And when we look at the workspace right now, I see it as an intractable conflict, especially with the great resignation that has been happening since the 2020s, where you've got about 70% of employees in the world right now seeking new employment because they're dissatisfied with their jobs. So it's super important for us to be thinking about how are we going to mend this conflict, because we need people to do jobs, and we don't want to create trauma and bad experiences for people in the workspace, but we're having this really intense conflict in the workspace right now about what should our cultural norms be? What should our work from home policies be? How should we handle meetings? What should our email policy be? How should we be communicating? So all of these things that have been changing and been impacted by the way in which the pandemic changed the way of work. And now we are trying to we're in this conflict of, do we go back to how it used to be? Or how do we incorporate things that we've learned? So we are also in this intense conflict period in the workspace. There was one program that Daniel Bartal looked at that actually had the ability to change ethos. And what was really fascinating about this one specific program was that it, instead of teaching people to just build positive relationships, they really actually got into the meat of the ethos. And they would show participants intense or very, very extreme political messages that were in line with their ethos. And then they would see those messages and they would react like, oh, wait, I don't believe that. But actually, you do believe it because it's coming from your ethos. And so it was almost this reverse psychology. Let's show them the worst of themselves, in a sense, and see how they respond to it. And this did something really, really interesting. It started to actually unfreeze the ethos. It unfreezed their attachment to what they thought about and how they saw the world. So what this taught a lot of the peace researchers was, look, if you can start to unfreeze this ethos and really start to change the worldview of people when they're in conflict, that's when you actually can start to make positive and progressive change. Well, when I was studying the ethos, I was also in tandem studying spiritualities. And in spiritualities, we talk about the ego a lot. This ego, it forms your worldview. It forms how you believe. It forms how you think, where you go, what you do. It drives you. And it's the ego has done something amazing. It makes you believe that it doesn't even exist, right? But really, there is this impulsiveness. There is this animalistic nature within all of us, this drive to only receive for ourselves, to only see ourselves, to only think of ourselves. And we have to be aware of it. And every single time I would read something about the ethos of conflict, this stuck out to me like, whoa, this is part of that ego complex. Ethos is helping to serve the ego, if you will. So the reason why SLIDE exists in many educational programs is because we're not actually challenging who is in control. And we need people to understand that their egos are in control of them unless you start to bring awareness and you start to unfreeze your worldview and your perspectives a little bit so that you can rise above the situational context and really see how you're reacting in tandem with other people. So we need to understand that the ethos of conflict is in many ways, they're like the dimensions of the self and our attachment to our identities. And so you can't really solve a problem without talking about it directly. And that's what I think we learn from the last study I talked about, where they actually were able to start shifting the ethos of conflict. What they did was they challenged people with their own beliefs. They challenged people with more extreme views of their own belief systems. And so I think when we're really trying to change workplace culture, if we're really trying to uproot petty professionalism like the belittling or the negative gossip or imbalance of power structures, fear-based culture, sick shaming, all of these things that make up these toxic and petty workplace cultures, we need to start talking about them openly. And further, we need to stop focusing on other people. It's not about what other people do as it relates to these types of things, but it's my own behavior. I have to start unfreezing myself. One of the things that happens is when we get in our ego tunnel vision, we think that everything is happening to us. We become very victimized. So it keeps us, this is a trick of the ego, it keeps us from being willing to own up to our own faults, to our own negativity. And so what we need to always remember is that the moment that we start to place blame on other people, the moment that we say, oh, it's not my problem, that might actually mean like, hang on a second, let me check in here. Do I have some responsibility? Do I have something to actually learn from this or to make a change in this area? So we can't solve problems without looking at the activity that's actually causing the problem and really talking openly about petty professionalism in the workspace. And then also building in a culture that actually addresses the ego. Building in a culture that actually talks about this ego structure and really builds in a new perspective. It says right here, I wrote this, in order to unfreeze the ethos, our goals need to be focused on a new peace-supporting narrative, and it has to actually be implemented. So we need to start looking at the way we're building culture in these organizations, and we need to ask ourselves, are these cultures serving these toxic norms? Like thinking about your disciplinary system and your employee performance-based programs, right? Like, do they serve your imbalanced power structure, or do they serve a more egalitarian style of leadership in your workplace? Like asking questions like that and really thinking about your culture. Are we actually urging leadership to look inward first for problems before they look externally for problems? And if you're lower in staff, also, before you go to the external world, go to the internal world. Go to the world that drives you and ask yourself, how am I responding? How am I reacting to the world? How might my own perspective, how might my own worldview be blocking me from being able to see other people's perspectives in this moment? And start to unfreeze your own ethos. Start to unfreeze the way that you're thinking about the workspace, the way that you're thinking about your relationships with other people in the workspace, and open your hearts, right? And really fight the ego. So if you're building a professional development program or any sort of leadership training in your organizations, you want to absolutely make sure you are incorporating the study of ego. Because when people go into these programs and we don't actually talk about how we could be at fault or what parts of us are actually the reason we're causing problems, we're not getting at the root cause. The root cause is our ego. It's not the other person's ego, it's our ego. This has been the Spiritual Hacking Conference Call. I appreciate you all being here this morning. You can find us at peacewith.net. We are on YouTube at peacewith and on TikTok at peacewith. Be sure to engage with us, like this video if you do enjoy it, and I will see you all next Monday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for Spiritual Hacking. Thank you so much.